Welcome back. So up to this point, we've focused pretty much exclusively on how to extract and transform data sources in the Power Query window, and very little on what happens when that data is actually loaded to Excel. So now that we feel pretty good about our transformed dataset, let's explore some different options for how we can load it into Excel. So my first step will just be to hit this Close and Load button, and then choose Close and Load. And after we wait a moment for the data to load, we see that not just our home sale dataset, which is where we've been making all of our modifications and adding our derived columns and so forth, has been dropped into Excel, but all the queries we had created against external data sources have been dropped into their own respective worksheets. We see that our Q4, Q3, and Q2 home sale datasets are here. Our dates lookup table is here. And so it turns out that this is what Power Query does by default. If we don't tell Power Query where we want the data that we have extracted from some source to be loaded to, it will load each individual query into its own worksheet. Now, very often, this isn't what we want. It's very common that some datasets are only needed as intermediate steps in the process of transforming our primary dataset, and we wouldn't really ever need to see them in isolation. For example, our home sale data Q4, Q3, and Q2 files were really just needed to the extent that we wanted to combine them into our main dataset. We really wouldn't have a need to see them individually. Now, Power Query does give us some different options for how we can load these data sources that turn out to be crucial for getting the most out of Excel's business intelligence capabilities. So the first step we'll take is to change how all of these secondary data sets that we're just using as intermediate steps in our overall transformation process are loaded. And we'll use our dates data set as the first example. So if I click out of this data set, you'll see that the rightmost tab on our Excel ribbon is the Power Pivot tab. But if I click back in, suddenly we have two contextual tabs. Now, one of these, the Table Design tab, appears because this data is structured as an Excel table. But the second appears because this table is being populated via a connection to a data source in Power Query. So if we click that tab, we see a number of options for editing and configuring that data connection. Now, as is so often the case with Excel, some of these options overlap with other methods for accomplishing the same thing. For example, clicking the Edit button will just take you right into the Power Query window. But the button we're going to focus on is Load To. So let's click that. And now we see a list of options for where and how to load our data set. And as you can see, the default option is Table, and that's exactly what happened. When we finally loaded this data set that we had extracted from some external data source, Excel loaded it into its own table in its own worksheet. But if we're only interested in a data set as an intermediate step in a larger process, we should choose Only Create Connection. So that means that in Power Query, this data is still available for us to use as part of a process that transforms some other data set, but it also means that this data won't be dropped into its own Excel worksheet, which we're really not interested in anyway. So if I click OK, now Excel is basically warning me that this table will be deleted as a result of this action. But that's actually what we want, so we'll click OK. And now you can see that the table disappears. And since there's no longer anything on this worksheet, I can go ahead and delete the worksheet. And just to allay any fears you might have that deleting that table will break our overall Power Query process because that data won't be available to it, let's go back to our Power Query editor. And you see that our dates data set, our dates query, is still there. But now we don't have that data cluttering up our Excel workbook. So very quickly, I'm going to cycle through all of our other data sets that we're using as intermediate steps but don't need to see in our Excel workbook and do the same thing with them. I'll change their Load To option to Connection Only. Okay, So at this point, you may be wondering why I didn't follow the same steps for our customer data set. Well, that's because, if you recall, the customer's worksheet here is actually the source data, not an import from some external file. So in all the other cases, our source data is a CSV file that exists outside of our Excel workbook. But in the case of this customer data, the table we see here is itself the data source, so I do need to keep this intact. So now we're down to this customer data lookup table that lives in this worksheet and our master home sale data set. Now, while I do want this data set to be loaded to a worksheet because it's the end result of all of our transformation processes, I'm actually going to make a slight tweak to how this data set's loaded as well. And that is to add it to the Excel data model. Now, don't worry about what that means just yet. We're going to explore that in much more depth in the videos to come. So again, I'll select my Query tab and hit the Load To button. And in this case, obviously, we want to continue loading the data to a table in our Excel workbook. But the option I'm going to change down here at the bottom of the dialog box is to choose to add this data to the data model. So basically, it's going to be added to two places. It's going to continue to be loaded into this table, but it's also going to be loaded into this thing called the data model. So let's click OK. And just because we're changing the loading configurations of this data set, Excel is giving us a little warning, but we'll click OK again. And now our data has reloaded into our Excel worksheet, but it's also in this other place called the data model. So now the question is, where and what is the data model? So we'll answer the where question first. If you select this Power Pivot tab on the Excel ribbon, we see some all new commands that we're definitely going to explore in more depth in the videos to come that pertain to the Excel data model and what you can do in it. For now though, we'll click this Manage button, which will take us straight into the Excel data model. So at this point you might be saying, big deal, this looks like just another Excel worksheet. And while it may look that way, it's not really the case. This isn't real Excel, and not all the same rules apply here as they do in Excel. You can do certain things to data in an Excel worksheet that you can't do here, and vice versa. In short, the data model is a place where data sets that are far larger than could ever be stored in an Excel worksheet can be stored in a very compressed way. And because of that, there are certain restrictions on what we can do in the data model versus what we could do in a standard worksheet. These restrictions are part of how the data model is so efficient at storing massive amounts of data. So the data model has two main views that we'll be using. One is the data view, which is what we're seeing here, that looks more or less like a standard Excel worksheet. Now the other view, which is arguably the most important and where we'll be spending most of our time, is the diagram view. Now in the diagram view, instead of seeing a preview of some of the data in our table, we instead see this little square with some metadata about our table. The name of the table, the name of the columns in it, and so forth. If you've ever used Microsoft Access, this might look familiar to you, but if not, don't worry. We'll be walking through the data model step by step soon enough. Now with just a single table added to our data model, the value of this diagram view isn't immediately clear. But once we start adding more tables to our data model, we'll be able to link those tables together so we can combine them in our reporting. And that's where the diagram view really shines. We'll start exploring that in the next video. I'll see you then.